Hey there, art nerds. Today I'm going to take you through my watercolor process for painting the cover of Curious Little Things, my brand new cottagecore and Lilliputian coloring book. If you're new here, hi, hello, welcome. I'm Becca Hilburn. I'm a watercolor comic artist and art supply reviewer, and I recently released a coloring book of some of my favorite illustrations from my yearly Lilliputian Living Challenge, which I do every October and have done every October since 2017. So if you enjoy cottagecore and tiny life, I hope you guys will check out the original Lilliputian Living, which contains the first 4 years of the art and the prompts. And of course, I hope you guys will check out Curious Little Things, my brand new coloring book, and hopefully color along with me. So today I'm going to walk you guys through my process for painting the cover of Curious Little Things. It was done entirely in watercolor and watercolor pencil. And if you guys buy Curious Little Things, you will actually have access to a download link where you can download a full res scan of this illustration, print it out onto the watercolor paper of your choice, and paint along with me. This illustration is also in Curious Little Things twice, once as a test page and the second time as a regular coloring page. And if you do decide to paint or color along with me, make sure to use the hashtag Curious Little Colors and tag me at NatoSoup so I can see what you guys have done, what direction you guys took this art in. If you're curious about making your own coloring book using self-publishing means or KDP, I do have a vlog where I talk about that process in some depth. And if you're one of my patrons on Patreon, I am more than happy to answer any questions you might have about producing your own coloring book or working with KDP, even things that I might not have addressed in the vlog. So if you like what I do and you want to help me continue to do it, you can join me at patreon.com/NatoSoup. So we are starting out with our penciled illustration. This was printed onto Stonehenge Aqua watercolor paper using my blue line technique, and I am inking it with a waterproof brush pen, the Sakura Pigma FB. This is a brush pen that I use all the time, and I highly recommend it. It is also alcohol marker safe, so it should be good for almost any kind of art that you want. Now, this inking was so that I could scan it and include this illustration in the book. I end up re-inking this later on for clarity, but we can talk about that a little bit more later. If you decide to print the line art and paint along with me, you have a couple of options. You can, one, print it out using a toner printer because toner printer ink is marker safe and waterproof once it's dried or cured to the paper. So you should be able to just print this out and paint along with me if you're using a toner printer. If you're using a water-based, dye-based inkjet printer, which is what most home printers are, you're going to want to potentially convert it to blue lines like I've done here, and I have plenty of tutorials here on the channel that will help you with that, so I'll try to remember to link them for you guys. You may want to re-pencil it. That will give you a chance to put your own spin on things. It'll also make it a lot easier to actually see the line art, and you may want to re-ink it like I'm doing here. You absolutely do not have to use the Sakura Pigma FB if you're not comfortable with it. You can definitely use microns, you can use the Copic multi-liners. Basically, if you're going to paint along, I would recommend that you use something waterproof, but what you use, so long as it's waterproof, is really up to you. Even Pit pens would be an excellent fit here. This illustration is very dense. There's a lot going on, notwithstanding my hair getting in the shot. So it took me several days to ink it. In fact, I think it took me about 3 days because I didn't want to put too much wear and tear on my drawing hand, because if I ruin that thing, I'm out of business. So I took my time with this one, and I wanted to make sure that I got the details just right and that I included plenty of details for you guys to be able to color. So there's 3 tiny faces, lots of wild roses, and plenty of dewdrops, as well as some bees hidden throughout this black and white illustration. after I finished inking it, I allowed it to cure for 24 hours. Then I used a white vinyl eraser to erase the graphite, and then I scanned it. So now we're going to stretch our watercolor paper. I'm using clean filtered water for this, and I'm going to stretch the front side of it twice because that reactivates those non-photo blue lines, that reactivates that water-based, dye-based ink. It allows it to come up, and that way it's far less noticeable when we're actually watercoloring it. This is kind of like my magic secret technique, and it enables me to create the kind of illustrations that I create and also to create watercolor comics. Now, once I've got it nice and stretched out, I'm going to start painting, and I'm using masking fluid. I'm using Winsor & Newton's removable masking fluid on a very cheap synthetic watercolor brush to mask out my dewdrops and other areas that I might want to reserve or paint later. I'm also going to go over this and just kind of splatter my masking fluid. That's going to give it a little bit more chaos and a little bit more randomness. I want you guys to let that dry fully, completely, and totally before you actually start your watercolor painting. We're going to start with a technique known as Grisaille or underpainting. In this instance, I'm actually using an ultramarine blue, and I'm doing kind of a monochromatic underpainting. I'm painting in all of the shadows first for everything, and this is going to really help tone the piece, and it's going to help set the mood, and it's also going to kind of help everything feel like it's affected by the same shadows and the same light source. So this can be a really helpful watercolor technique in pulling your watercolor illustrations together, and it's one that I use very frequently. As layers dry, I'm also assessing them and then mixing my toning solution a little bit more saturated, so with more ultramarine, and going back in and adding in darker shadows in some areas, just so that we can start building up that lighting and contrast. So by doing your lighting and your shading earlier on like this, before we really start thinking about color, it really allows you to focus on that light and contrast. So if light and contrast is something you struggle with, using these kinds of underpainting techniques, especially with watercolor, which is a translucent media, can help solve some of those problems and can help establish some of those shadows and that light source early on, and make it a lot easier to actually go in and add your color and maintain your contrast. Once I've finished with my Grisaille underpainting, I'm going to start adding in my local color. We're starting with some yellows. This is kind of a neutral yellow, somewhere between a cool yellow and a warm yellow. And while that's still wet, I'm dipping in just a little bit of my warmer yellow. I don't necessarily want to talk about brand specifics because different artists have different watercolors, and I want you guys to be able to paint along with me with what you've got. So now I'm using an Opera Rose rose to start blocking in some of our roses. And I'm going to kind of try to leave the center a little bit more open, because if you guys reference wild roses, which is what I'm doing as I'm painting this, I've got them pulled up on Google Images so I know what I'm doing and I know what they look like. I want to leave the center a little bit lighter and a little bit more open, because that's something that I really like about wild roses, and that's something that I wanted to capture and convey with the cover. I also want to capture some of that magic you get when opera rose or really almost fluorescent pinks start to mix with yellows and oranges. You get this beautiful glow-like color. I also used a little bit of clean water to push the color back just a little bit, allowed that to dry, and now I'm going in with my second layer of the same color. I felt like I lost some of that ultramarine blue shading that I wanted for the flowers. So once my opera rose dried, I'm going in with a little bit of ultramarine blue just to reestablish some of those shadows. You absolutely do not have to do this or anything I show you in this tutorial if it doesn't serve you, if it doesn't serve your art, or if you don't like it. These are just suggestions and tips on what I did with my piece. But like I said earlier, feel absolutely free to make this completely and totally your own. So we're going to start now with the rose hips. I'm doing an under layer of our hot pink, and I'm also going to start adding in some red to our opera rose and start doing the edges of our wild roses. And as you guys can see, I'm working from flower to flower, one petal at a time to do this. That allows me to blend things out and work wet into wet, and it also makes a larger task much more manageable. I'm going to start adding in a sienna red or a quinacridone sienna brown. It's really like a brownish red that doesn't have a lot of granulation to the rose hips to start kind of establishing that almost orangish color that rose hips seem to have in the reference that I'm using here. I'm also going back in with clean water, relifting some areas that got too dark, as you guys can see with the clean paper towel, and then I'm kind of reblending things. So now is an excellent time to point out that this illustration took about a week of 8-hour days to paint, and this has been time-lapsed significantly. So I want to help kind of dispel the notion that art is a fast thing. Whether you're working digitally or traditionally, art takes time. And with these sort of time lapses, sometimes it can be difficult for me to cover every single area of what I'm doing. But that is why I've got some really great watercolor playlists that should be able to help you pick up a brush and paint at no matter what stage you are in your watercolor journey. So I'm just working on establishing the color and the contrast of our rose hips as compared to our wild roses, adding in some naphthalide maroon and starting to build in some of the shadow. So an interesting thing about this illustration, if you guys remember, is that it's going to have a completely black background. So what I'm doing is I'm just kind of establishing some of the colors earlier on, and then once we're about at the midway point, I'll start adding in the background, and then we can work on tweaking and balancing everything. When it comes to watercolor, I try not to finish any one area to completion, because I find that as the piece develops what you want to draw contrast to, what you want to draw attention to may change as you're working on it. So if you finish any one area out completely, that can really throw you off, and you may find yourself going back in and reworking that a lot. So for the leaves, I'm starting with a really light wash of a cool yellow, mainly on the areas that would be hitting the light. And then when necessary, I'm blending that out with some clean water. Next, I'm going to go in with a cooler blue. This is a phthalo blue, and I'm going to start knocking in the shadows on our leaves. Now, some of them are going to be completely in shadow, and some of them it's just going to be the center and the veins of the leaves that are going to be in shadow. I apologize because I have a little bit of missing footage here, but I already established some of the shadows on the darker skin tones, and I did that using kind of a mauve with some alizarin crimson to kind of block in the blush and the lips and the cheeks. And I have a lot of tutorials on painting different skin tones in watercolor. So check that description below, because I'm going to have all the materials that we use for today's tutorial, as well as other recommended watercolor tutorials. So if you have any questions, make sure you check the description first, but then feel free to reach out to me either in the comment section, or if you'd like a more immediate response, you can reach out to me on my art-centric Discord server, The Paint Box, and I'll have a link to that in the description as well. So we have 3 different skin tones going on today. We have a really light skin tone over to the left. We have kind of a medium warmer skin tone to the bottom right, and then at the top right we're going to have a much darker, cooler skin tone. Because when I make books, I want people to be able to see themselves in my books. So I think including a wide array of diversity is really important, because people deserve to feel seen and they deserve to see themselves in the books they love. And this is particularly true, in my opinion, with coloring books like mine that have a lot of figurative work in them. So Lilliputian Living includes all kinds of different people at all different stages of life, different ethnicities, different abilities. So hopefully you can find yourself in the pages of Lilliputian Living and in Curious Little Things. So right now I'm just kind of working on things. I'm filling in I guess they would be the stamens from the flowers that are still on the rose hips. And I'm really heavily working from reference. I'm also starting to paint the bees. We're starting with kind of the yellowish undercolor that I utilize. And that way, when we add in our black, we can just kind of work reductively and let the yellow show through to imply that there's pollen on our bees. At this stage, I'm kind of working on several things at once. So I might do a layer of a skin tone, and then while that's drying, I might move on to the next person, or I might move on to the bees. I'm also working with several ceramic palettes. I highly recommend ceramic palettes if you don't have to travel a lot or you're not packing up your art supplies frequently. Like say if you lived in a dorm room or if you were doing it at school, plastic palettes might be a better fit for you. But if you are more stationary and you don't have to pack up and move everything, ceramic palettes can be a wonderful resource to have. It's much easier to reactivate your paints and to reuse them. So don't feel like you need to remix your paints. Watercolor artists will often allow our paints to dry and then add some water, and that gives us a more saturated version of the color. So we're also utilizing time and evaporation to achieve the kind of colors that we want. I'm painting with silver black velvet round watercolor brushes. I often joke that these are good all-rounders. They are good and useful for a variety of things, which as a watercolor comic artist, having good workhorse brushes is really important. I also went back and I added a bit more shadow to the hair of some of our girls, and I've started blocking in their hair as well. Now, I apologize. That's a little bit difficult to see. I can't just pull in on one since we're jumping around so much. But as I mentioned, I do have tutorials where I demonstrate how to paint different hair, how to draw different hair. I've got lots of tutorials for you guys. This cover illustration tutorial is really more of kind of a general tutorial to get you guys excited about the book and to get you guys excited about watercolor. But I've got lots of more specific watercolor tutorials to help you out. So next I am kind of blocking in our leaves, and I'm using Hooker's green for this. So it's like a nice sort of middle of the road green, not too blue, not too warm, and it works really well for painting foliage, especially if you glaze it on top of our underpainting of yellow and blue and allow those colors to do a lot of the shading and a lot of the work for you by optically blending the colors. Whenever I'm watercoloring, I'm constantly reassessing my work, and I wanted to go back in and add some additional highlights to our leaves. So I'm working with a semi-opaque yellow. I believe this is bismuth yellow, which means it will layer over the green and you'll actually be able to see that yellow to add in some additional sunlight. So now that I've got everything kind of blocked in, everything's at kind of a midway point, I can start painting the background. And for this, my recommendation would be that you work with black gouache at some point rather than black watercolor, because I was never really able to achieve the richness and the saturation that I really wanted from this. Fortunately, I was able to adjust it in Photoshop quite a bit before we put it on the cover and back cover of the book, because what you guys aren't seeing is that I actually have a big sheet of stretched watercolor paper that I've just been applying this black color to layer by layer as I'm applying it to the front cover. That way the front and back covers match and they look like they belong together. This is also a good opportunity to point out that I'm working with a cotton rag watercolor paper, so it's going to be able to handle a lot of layers. It's going to be able to handle a lot of water. It's going to be able to handle a lot of washes, and it's going to kind of absorb some of those pigments. If you're working on a cellulose or wood pulp paper, then I would recommend kind of rethinking how you approach this illustration, limiting your layers, because those kind of papers just can't take as much water and they can't take as many glazes or as many techniques as we're using in this tutorial today. So if you're working with a cellulose paper, I would recommend you keep it light, you keep it airy, and you keep it kind of simple, and you'll be a lot happier with the end results. I'm also utilizing some of that background color to add in some shading to our leaves so that they don't feel like they were copy and pasted onto the background, but rather that this whole is emerging from the background, kind of tying the two together. You guys can probably also see why I recommend that you use a black gouache at some point for this, just because it's going to give you that depth of color and that opacity that I think I was looking for this. Of course, you don't have to do the background black at all. In fact, I opted to do the background black because when we were researching adult coloring books, that was a really common thing. And I think there's a couple reasons why people opt to go with black backgrounds. One, it makes the colors really pop. They really stand out against that black background and they're much more eye-catching. The other reason is I think it makes it feel more like a coloring book for adults, something that might appeal to adults. It gives it a little bit more class and a little bit more elegance rather than, just bright primary colors that are more common with children's coloring books. Of course, you can color in whatever coloring book you want to color in. Just because it's for adults or just because it's for kids does not mean that you can't enjoy it. And Curious Little Things is really more of an all ages coloring book. There's some simpler illustrations, there's some more complicated illustrations. There are illustrations that have a background and tell a story. There are illustrations where the background is very simple. There are illustrations that really invite you to add your own designs and your own flair and your own pattern. There are illustrations that are bigger and more open and are easier to use with alcohol markers or other blending techniques. There are illustrations that have loads of smaller patterns on them that might be more fun for gel pens. I really tried to include a little something for everyone. So hopefully you guys will check it out and enjoy it. So now that I've got some of those background layers on our background, I wanted to go in and just make the leaves feel more vibrant and more juicy. So we're working with Hooker's Green again. We're doing another layer of it, but I'm not covering the entirety of the leaves with this color. I'm really trying to leave some rim lighting and starting to lean into the color story and to the lighting that we worked so hard to establish earlier on in this illustration. So at this stage, there's going to just be a lot of back and forth, doing a thing, letting it dry, assessing how it looks, going in, adjusting other things, adding additional layers. But I knew from the get-go that it was going to take a lot of layers to get our background color as saturated as I wanted it to be. I didn't want it to be just straight up black. I actually wanted it to be kind of like a dark bluish, tealish black that kind of reflects the leaves of the flowers and doesn't feel as stark as, say, just like straight up black. So that's why I didn't just grab a gouache and use the gouache for the background from the get-go. It's why I took the time to really kind of build up the layers and build up the colors. It is very time consuming. It is not necessarily something that I would recommend to, just someone who's coloring this piece just for fun. Actually, if I were you and I were coloring this piece just for fun on watercolor paper, I would really lean into like filling in that wreath with more blues and greens and kind of utilizing a silhouette of the shapes to make it look fuller and to just kind of fill in the rest of the illustration and just kind of freehand those shapes rather than like filling it in with black. I think that would look really beautiful. Would it have worked as well for a cover? No, not really. But if I could go in a different direction with this, that would definitely be the direction I would go in. Or maybe I'd fill in the center with some more of our wild roses or maybe some more bees. We left the center open though so that we could put the text in there and that there wouldn't be any overlap and it wouldn't be overly distracting. So in terms of a cover, a lot of thought and a lot of consideration went into this. But if I were going to redo this as just an illustration for fun, I would definitely add some additional things and really make it my own and make it kind of stand out as an illustration on its own. So you guys can also see how watercolor has a tendency of drying much lighter and less saturated than when it went down. That's particularly noticeable when you're trying to do a really dark black background like what we've got going on here. So I felt like everything was kind of static at this point, so I took a spray bottle of clean water and just spritzed the heck out of it. And that encourages the colors to blend and bleed and kind of move, and that kind of ties everything together a little bit because you've got that color movement, and it just makes it feel like the colors are influencing one another and that the light is bouncing off, say, the green leaves and onto our hot pink flowers, and it just kind of loosens things up and makes it, you know, a little bit more fun. I'm also lifting some areas with clean water and then going back in with our yellow and kind of readjusting our lighting, and then going back in with our kind of indigo mix, our shadow color for the leaves, and adjusting that as well. And I think it's really important to show you guys kind of the back and forth process, the adjustment process of art. So it wasn't until grad school that I had a professor who talked about how when you're making art, you're really massaging the art into place. You're sculpting it into place. It isn't just as straightforward as do step 1, step 2, step 3. There's a lot of taking breaks and looking at what you've done and thinking about it and making adjustments. There's a whole ugly phase that you have to get through where, you know, that's where the phrase trust the process comes from. You got to get past that ugly phase before you can start making some really hard decisions. But that's why I don't like doing just like straightforward tutorials of do this, then do this, then do this, other than in my Stash Buster series, which those are very, very simple watercolor tutorials that are meant to produce really cute watercolor bookmarks using stuff you've got in your watercolor stash. But generally for me, when it comes to comic pages and illustrations, there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of time. There's a lot of analyzing what I've done and making adjustments. And just because I handle a painting one way this time does not mean I would handle it the same way the next time, or that I would even recommend that other people handle it that way. So on that note, I felt like there just wasn't enough shadow and contrast with the leaves. They weren't kind of disappearing into the background the way I wanted them to. So I'm going in with more of that indigo mix to add in some more shadows and to kind of give it some more contrast and to give it some more depth, and honestly to make it look a little bit more juicy, to give it that kind of like lush foliage effect. And the masking fluid is still on our dewdrops. We are still masking all of that off. We're not near removing the masking fluid just yet. However, after allowing it to dry overnight, we can remove our masking fluid. You want to wait until the paper is totally dry before you attempt to remove your masking fluid. That will increase your chances of it not tearing up your paper. And I'm also using what's known as a masking fluid frisket to remove my masking fluid. So I also wanted to kind of get some more liveliness. So those dewdrops are very stark and they're very white. So I'm utilizing my spray bottle to add in some lifted out dewdrops, and I lift those out using a paper towel, but also to encourage some of those colors to move into the dewdrops and to kind of influence that. Then once that had a chance to dry, I'm using a little bit of our local color. So depending on the object, it's going to be like the base color of that. And I'm painting in the center of the dewdrops. That way it looks like you can actually see the color of the object through the water. And that gives it more of a sense of dimensionality, and it doesn't feel so much like just white dewdrops on the paper. I'm also using this as an opportunity to adjust the contrast in the hair and to adjust the contrast on the skin. And that way it really makes our characters look like they're receding into the foliage, like they're being hidden by the foliage. Like these curious little things are looking at the world around them. So as I do this kind of work, I usually will find more masking fluid that I missed the first time. So you let it dry, then you go back in, you pick it up. So now I'm creating a very lazy mask of white copier paper because I'm going to do some splatter techniques, and I'm starting that out with some indigo, and then I'm going to go and do the same thing with the yellow. And I mask the faces just because I don't want any huge splotches of blue in the middle of the face or in the middle of the nose that might look just really weird or awkward. And then again, we go in with our black paint. This is basically me working from the half pan with just a little bit of water, trying to get it as saturated as possible. And we're filling in our background using a round brush, the largest round you are comfortable using, which is challenging because we've got all these little islands that we're going to need to fill in with watercolor. Once that dry, we have another opportunity to go back in and add some more shading and contrast. So that's what I mean about there isn't just like straightforward, do this step, do this step, do this step, do this step. There's a lot of training your eye and taking breaks and coming back to it with kind of a fresh mind so that you can analyze it and figure out what is working and what isn't working and making adjustments. And with a step-by-step tutorial, you're really not able to leave room for that, and that's such an important part of my process. So I always feel kind of weird when I do these tutorials. They're really more like art and chats because I heavily encourage you to learn from my mistakes and to make it your own and to do your own sort of thing and to bring in your own kind of techniques. And if there are any watercolor techniques that you love that you never see me use, let me know down in the comments. I'm always open to trying something new, and I'm always interested in getting a little bit more liveliness into my work. So once the paper had a chance to dry fully, I pull out my watercolor pencils, and I usually save these for the end. I save them to do really fine details. I save them to add in shading that I just wasn't able to get. I save them to do some color adjustment, like layering yellow on top of the greens to really bring out that sunlit effect. And I also save them to just kind of adjust the contrast and the color. So they're kind of like the final stages of the watercolor illustration. And I don't really use a whole lot of watercolor pencil. I use them on basically every watercolor illustration that I do, but it's really for like the finishing touches, just for like final adjustments and to kind of tie things together. Now, one of the things I really like about watercolor pencils is with the good ones, they are kind of opaque when you first put them down, and then as you blend them out with water, you can make them more translucent. So this is really helpful for kind of bringing back some lost color or adjusting lighting or adjusting opacity on something and really kind of getting your illustration to the point where you want it to be. And even this far along, I'll still bring out the old spray bottle and give it a few spritzes because I want some of that black to kind of flood into the leaves and kind of make them disappear a bit more into the background. So it feels like this is coming forward out of a darker background. Mentioned earlier when we were inking the first time that this would not be the only time that we're inking. So to kind of clean things up, adjust the contrast, and to get rid of some of the muddiness, I've pulled out my Sakura Pigma FB again. I'm not going to re-ink the whole thing. I'm just re-inking areas that need some clarity or need additional shadow or contrast. Now, one of the reasons I do this is even though watercolor is a transparent medium, meaning you can mostly see through it, some colors are more opaque than others. And as they layer on top of your line art, it can make your line art like seem kind of misty, less visible, or it can make it feel kind of muddy or unintentional. And for a while, I didn't realize, it didn't click for me that I could always go back and re-ink it and adjust that clarity and adjust that color. And I was wondering why my illustrations sometimes just felt muddier than I really would have liked. But re-inking allows me to adjust that contrast and to kind of clean things up and to tie things together. And it can also allow me to fix some mistakes that may have happened while we were watercoloring. I say this in just about every Art and Chat watercolor tutorial, but by the time I bring out the white gouache, that's like one of my favorite parts. That's the part where things really start to get tied together. We're adding the finishing touches, and you can really see how the finished piece is going to look. But even after I've pulled out the white gouache, I may sometimes go back and pull out the watercolor pencils because it's all about evaluating your work and making adjustments as you go and making corrections so that your piece looks the way you want it to look, or even better than what you originally had in mind. Now, this is pretty close work, so my face is going to get in the camera shot a fair amount because I am really getting on top of it and adding in those details, adding in rim lighting, adding in highlight, adding some rim lighting around the petals to help kind of pull some of them forward and differentiate them from the other flowers, so it doesn't just become like this mass of a flower wreath. They all feel like individual distinct things. But this is one of my favorite parts. It's one of the funnest parts, possibly because I know that the end is in sight, but also because it really kind of ties it together. And it's a really good opportunity to kind of show your own individual taste as an artist. Not that this whole thing isn't an opportunity to do that, but how you handle your rim lighting and how you adjust your colors, that can really add a lot of surface polish and pizzazz to your art. So I would say our illustration is just about finished. All we need to do is let it dry fully and completely and then carefully remove the blue tape. Supposedly, if you use a hairdryer, it can loosen up that adhesive and make it easier to pull away from your paper. That might be particularly helpful if you're working with a cotton rag like the Stonehenge that for some reason just loves to get chewed up by blue tape. But we are now finished with the watercolor portion, the traditional media portion of this illustration. After I finished it, I scanned it at 1200 DPI. I needed it a little bit bigger than what I actually painted it at. And I took it into Photoshop and I actually adjusted the heck out of some of the colors. I added in a lot more blues and I really darkened up that black background. So if you're curious to see what's inside Curious Little Things, I hope you guys will check out my first coloring book vlog, and I hope you guys will consider ordering your own copy or a copy to give to someone you love of Curious Little Things. When you buy from me, you are supporting a small business and an independent creator, and I really appreciate it. It goes such a long way in encouraging me and helping me to continue to make books and comics and tutorials like this one. So if you like what I do, supporting it is super helpful. Curious Little Things is available on Amazon and it is also available from my shop. If you order it from my shop, I always send extra goodies, although it does take me a little bit longer than it would take Amazon because I do have to put it together and get it out to you guys. But I love being able to fulfill orders like that, and I really appreciate every single one of them, whether it's from Amazon or from the shop. Thank you guys so much. So tutorials like this are brought to you by my coloring book, of course, but they're also brought to you guys by my amazing patrons on Patreon. Their financial support allows me to dedicate the time and resources it takes to creating tutorials like this one. So thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. If you like what I do and you want to help me continue to do it, you can join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. If you like my art and you want to see more of it, you can follow me on these socials here. Thank you guys so much for watching and hanging out with me today. I hope to see you guys again really soon.